Hello everyone and welcome to the RB Sides, a music review channel dedicated entirely to reviewing remix albums and EPs. In this review we're going to be looking at Girl in the Half Pearl Remix Edition, or GITHP as I'm going to be calling it for short. This is a full-length remix of Liv's 2023 album Girl in the Half Pearl, with all 17 of the tracks featuring a full overhaul from the producer and record label owner Ben Hixon. Liv is an artist I first became aware of in 2020 at the release of her debut album Couldn't Wait to Tell You. She has a pretty distinctive avant-garde R&B style, or R&B as one publication called it, which would be a great name for it if it didn't sound awful said out loud. This is why print journalism has gone down the shitter in recent times. They just don't care about practicality. And she's been a force in this world ever since her debut EP Frank was released in... Well, I guess she should know what she's doing by now. Although I was aware of her first album, I didn't really give it a proper listen at the time, so I gave her most recent album, Girl in the Half Pearl, a go at the end of last year, and it took a couple of listens, but really got into it. It's definitely got a pretty unique vibe to it, so when I saw that there was a remix edition available, then I thought, okay, that's definitely worth a look. And the fact that the remix edition has one artist remixing all 17 tracks on there made me think, okay, definitely got to cover this on the RB sides.
Watch the phone light and turn your face down. Feel my heart sinking into the gutter.
Although Girl in the Half Pearl has kind of a unique sound world to it, it's not one that I was completely unprepared for. I wouldn't say it was a movement, but in the last decade there have been a bunch of different artists who've been pushing R&B in a direction that seems darker and colder than its mainstream contemporaries. I first started hearing this in the early work of FKA Twigs and Serpent with Feet, and since then I've kind of heard this in a bunch of other artists as well, like Terza, Dawuna, Morning A Black Star, Shy Girl. They're all artists who have been taking in different influences into the production of R&B with things like trip hop, IDM, murky music concrete elements, digidub. None of them are really unified by anything other than their genre and the general mood of their production, and it's pretty much the same with Liv. There aren't many albums that I feel Girl in the Half Pearl directly sounds like. In terms of contemporaries, there's Lorraine James and Kelela, where there's a slight resemblance, but they're all taking it in quite different directions. Kelela's productions tend to veer more towards ravey elements, whilst Lorraine James has kind of an IDM drum and bass underpinning. Liv does use some of these elements in this album, but they're more as a kind of garnish or even a blemish on the tracks than an overarching theme. A few extra producers are credited in the making of this album, including John Carroll Kirby, Aaron Liao, Mindsign and Solomon Phonic, but the lion's share of that work is done by Liv herself, and you can very much hear why. It's basically a heartbreak album about a toxic relationship that Liv was in, which is not necessarily an unusual topic for R&B to cover, or even any singer-songwriter genre for that matter, but you can very much hear in the production on this album that Liv is trying to encapsulate the mood in the musical elements just as much as she is in the vocals and the lyrics. It's an album about chaotic, self-destructive, dissociative behaviour, and the first track, Gardetto, sets the tone of the album running perfectly. It starts with the phrase "oh no" repeated over and over, and a discordant beat boop synth.
Oh no.
Sounds a bit like those arpeggiators in that episode of Dexter's Laboratory. We then get a couple of jazz elements come in. You've got the 2-chord pattern that's very similar to The Beat Goes On by Buddy Rich. Then you've got a bass lick underneath that is interpolated from John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. Some skittering break beats that are almost drum and bass but not quite. And then in the last minute you get some Fender Rhodes chords that come in as if to say, this is R&B, but not as you know it. And then it ends on some backwards drums and some phone dial tones. There's a lot of different elements that have gone into this first track. Production wise, Liv's vocals are quite heavy on the treble, quite low on the bass, so that they've got this kind of distant quality to them. And this is a pretty regular theme throughout the album. In an interview with Pitchfork, Liv noted that the relationship that the album was built around left her in a state where she was avoiding friends, avoiding herself, avoiding spending time alone. That sense of detachment seems to be where this vocal processing comes from a lot. There's something kind of ghostly about her vocal presence throughout the album for the most part. And you can hear that in some of the production choices on this album as well. On the second track, A Slumber Party, there's this muffled rumbling beat in the background that sounds like there's a party happening in the room next to the studio.
Will I really make time for this? A naked silhouette on the floor. Oh, so you bound to make it wrong.
On Ghost, you've got a very drum and bassy usage of the amen break, but these drum samples kind of coexist with the R&B beat that comes in underneath rather than work with it. It just sort of floats there as a blemish, and again it's a really cool device in terms of like the dissociative qualities. The beat on How They Like Me almost sounds like something erupting from beneath the surface. But it just loops over and over to give this very uneasy pulse to the track. There are a couple of tracks on this album that seem like more, shall we say, traditional R&B songs. Wild Animals, for example, is a track that seems like it would fit pretty well on an Erykah Badu album, which, given that Badu herself hosted a streaming party for the release of Liv's first album, is very appropriate. You've got these slightly wonky piano samples in it, and Liv's vocals are very clear on this one as she sings about how boys can kind of be like wild animals.
I'ma be the bitch tell you personally that most of these dogs don't deserve a meal. Cause they always wanna bite when they see me.
Even with the composition of this one though, there's a few little rug pulls here and there, like the fun little record scratch sample in the background. And I like the way that the pre-chorus goes on just slightly longer than you feel like it should do as well. It's a nice way of keeping you on your toes. Then there's Find Out, which in a way feels like it chronologically should belong at the end of the album, as Liv describes it as a moment of realization where you learn what it means to love yourself and accept what you feel like you deserve.
Sitting alone, I'm talking on the phone. Not with you, though, why even bother?
And it's underpinned by this big soul sample, that kind of who gives a crap about the drums sampling. Although that said, there is a little extra percussion that's been borrowed from Method Man and Redman's Da Rock Wilder. What's great about this album as well is Liv's vocal range, as she goes from soft, almost whispered moments where she repeats the phrase I love you on the track 6 Weeks, a gesture which in the wrong hands can very much seem quite obnoxious, but here there's just this plaintive desperation about it. And the lyrics do seem like it could be a song about miscarriage, so has a pretty harrowing effect overall. Whereas on some tracks, most notably Clowns, she can also go into this very aggressive, shouty rapping, with the production kind of distorted as if she's letting you have it down the phone. Liv mentioned in an interview that this was kind of a way of getting a lot of emotional detritus out of her system, given that she didn't really have anyone to talk to at the time about the issues she was facing. And although this makes for some great music for the most part, I will say it does seem to result in the album's biggest weakness as well, which is that it's a little too long. For me, the album peaks at Wild Animals, and there's a decent follow-up track as well in the form of Reset, which prominently interpolates a bit of soundtrack from the game Bomberman Hero. And had the album ended here, I think it would have been an incredible piece of work overall. Beyond this point though, I feel like the production starts to get a little bit samey in places. The loops start becoming a bit more relentless and everything just starts feeling a bit too numb. It does end on a decent note with the chipmunked soul of Glass Shadows, and there's a nice little instrumental skit called Back Alley, but it just feels a little bit too much of a slog, this last part of the album, as almost as if it's just a collection of bonus tracks that have been thrown in. That criticism aside though, I really like this album for the most part. In terms of remixing this album, it's in a way hard to imagine it in the abstract because Liv has such a singular vision that it's hard to imagine how anyone would tinker with it. Generally tends to be artists more on the avant-garde, genre-bending side of things who I would favour for this sort of thing. However, it does seem that Liv had very different ideas. Ben Hixon is a name that I had no familiarity with prior to researching this review. Hixon is a DJ who runs the Dolphin Records label, who released some of Liv's earliest work back in 2017 and 2018. Hixon also produced most of the tracks on Liv's debut EP Frank, and you can definitely hear the beginnings of this R&B style that Liv has on Girl in the Half Pearl around this point.
Can't keep love, wanna take it to the sunshine. It's burning up.
In terms of his own music though, Hixon's raison d'etre very much seems to be house. Specifically that kind of Chicago deep house that Larry Heard, aka Mr. Fingers, developed. All of the EPs and the 2 albums on Hixon's Bandcamp are full of house jams. The kick drums are pretty heavy, the deep house chords are pretty pleasant throughout all these tracks. Solid and often minimal bass lines, and there's usually a little bit of looped vocal in the mix. Nothing that I've heard here is particularly reinventing the wheel, but if you're into that kind of deep house sound, then it's pretty damn solid stuff. And had Hixon been drafted in to do maybe an EP full of remixes of Girl in the Half Pearl, then I very much would understand. But this is a full-length reinterpretation of the album from Hixon, and to be fair, it's not necessarily unheard of entire remix albums from one artist. The first review on this channel was an example of that, but generally I tend to find that when an album does get a full overhaul from one artist, it tends to work well when it's like a dub producer, as dub very much is about reorganising the original elements of a track. Prior to this though, I'd never heard of an instance of a deep house producer reinterpreting an entire album from start to finish. And certainly on the basis of Hixon's own albums, there isn't a suggestion that he's that interested in variety. And so I went into this remix album thinking, is it just going to be 17 deep house remixes of Liv? And certainly the first couple of tracks do make it seem like it's going that way, with the remix of Gardetto that opens very much being in Ben Hixon's deep house style. In the 7-minute track, you get a straight up 4/4 kick drum, a mechanical breathy loop in the background, and a slightly muffled bass line. And there's some disco chirrups and some pleasant keyboards throughout the track, and as it goes along, you get some bass and keyboard noodling to give it a kind of acid jazz feel. It very much feels like a remix to introduce who Ben Hixon is, as it's basically all of Hixon's trademark stuff thrown into one all-purpose 7-minute track. It's a great showcase of his house skills, but crucially it has very little to do with the original track whatsoever. There's an incomprehensible 1-bar loop of Liv's vocals that fades up after the 2-minute mark, and that's pretty much it. This pattern seems to continue on Hixon's remix of A Slumber Party, although this one comes in at a brisk 4.5 minutes. It does sort of seem like Hixon did the first remix and then realised he had a whole album to fill, so maybe he needed to cut things down a little bit. This is another house number, slightly slower tempo this one, with some rattling percussion that gives it a slight reggaeton flick. It's a 1-note bass line and more of the keyboard noodling that we heard in the first track. He takes the opening spoken word section where Liv is basically asking someone down the phone if they want to come to a sleepover.
I have wine, I have a lot of things we like. We can have a sleepover. I really love a sleepover.
That gets repeated a few times throughout the track, while there's a little snippet of vocal that's kind of been turned into this weird inhale hiccup sound. Beyond that though, again, not that much in common with Liv's original. It seems like a lot of the original production is being left on the cutting room floor here. On his remix of track 3, Lake Psilocybin, however, he does throw his first curveball. The original is this kind of squelchy R&B slow jam. Rather than deep housing this one, however, Hixon actually goes into fast-paced electro territory for this. Which would almost be going into ghetto tech territory if it weren't for the absence of voluptuous bass lines and banging on about buttholes. This one seems to have a fair few more of the elements from the original than the previous two tracks did, but Hixon seems to go even harder on the distortion than Liv does. The keyboards have gone full-blown muffled, once again like they're coming from somewhere else. The vocals dip in and out of comprehension, mostly out, and the overall effect is even more dissociative than the original, and it's a very odd left turn that has nothing to do with the last two remixes, but it's pretty welcome. Then on the remix of the fourth track, 6 Weeks, we get a return to house tempo, but this time he goes into breakbeat territory. Although the effect is very much similar to the previous track, it just kind of seems to make everything a lot creepier sounding than it was. The vocals are faint and low-pitched and just sound like the life's been strangled out of them. And the keyboards, which I believe are Hixon's own, kind of sound like they've been dug out of some sort of crackly vinyl loop from the 1920s. Eventually Hixon brings a full house beat in at the end of the track, but rather than make it more dancey, it just gives it a real chilling vibe. The blurb for this remix album on Bandcamp describes it as an energized feel-good of an album, ultimately symbolising how one can bounce back after heartbreak. But the last two tracks really don't sound like that at all mood-wise. They sound just as dissociative as Liv's one does, if not more so. And in these opening 4 remixes, we do get a kind of blueprint for the 3 different approaches that Hixon seems to take throughout the rest of this remix album. There are tracks where Hixon just kind of does his standard deep house thing and most of the time ignores the vast majority of the original. There are tracks where Hixon just pushes his sound into a completely different stylistic territory to the house. And then there are tracks where Hixon tries to find a middle ground between his house production and the vibe of Liv's production. And I'd say it's these latter two styles where this remix album is more interesting, if not always necessarily more successful. When Hixon just goes up for his usual house style, it very much just seems to be much of a muchness. Some of these tracks are pretty decent, like his remix of Find Out, which has a faster techno tempo to it. A little bit of Liv's vocal in this one again, but it sounds like it's being vocalised through one of those toy microphones you got as a kid. My favourite of the Deep House remixes is probably Snowing, which is also one of my favourite tracks from the original album. Although it's a little strange how Hixon reinterprets this one, as some of the elements of the original almost seem like they're perfect for a house refit. Like these icy arpeggiators and these big synth sweeps that basically make it sound as arctic as the title suggests. Hixon doesn't really use any of these elements in his remix, although he does fashion a chord sequence that gives a similar icy feel. He also brings the vocals, which are very much buried in the original version, to the fore on his remix, and I think that's a really nice touch, especially with some of the reverb effects that he's put on them, which give them this sort of 90s rave house feel. The snare drum is also very 90s on this. It's one of those kind of like clicked snares that you used to get. It gives it a real swagger, and yeah, I think this is one of the most solid remixes on this album, even if it is kind of treading water for Hixon. Later on in the album though, there are remixes of tracks like Back Alley and Our Father, which just feel like they've been shoehorned in to fill out the runtime. You get the same sort of weighty beats and minimal chord loops, and they're kind of fine, but just feel a bit lifeless at this point. Admittedly, this is from the section of the album that I described as being a bit of a slog in the original formation, but that's kind of where you hope the remix album kicks in, you know? In the tracks where Hixon changes up his genre, we do get some pretty interesting results, even if he doesn't seem like he's on the most comfortable ground. With his remix of How They Like Me, for example, he replaces the electro beat of the original with a trap beat.
She said she never seen me, but then they show up with a similar guy.
The synths are directly taken from the original, and the vocals have been kind of deepened, which once again gives it a strange ghostly feel to it, but it does feel the most like a straight up R&B cut out of anything here. His remix of Wild Animals once again goes into that pseudo ghetto tech territory with the fast electro beat. Those same deep house keyboards are in the mix on this one, but there's a nice tempering of them whereby he cuts those out so that he can let Liv's vocals shine on their own. Meanwhile, his remix of Reset is built around an aggressive, almost footwork style beat, ditching the original Bomberman synths in favour of a chord sequence that's a little bit simpler. It's a cool idea for a remix, but I have to say the percussion, it gets a little wearing after a while. There's a moment where it falls out to a lighter beat towards the end, and I feel like maybe some more of that space would have made this a bit better, especially given that there's some gorgeous snippets of piano right towards the end of this track. The following remix, Underground, also goes into footwork territory, coming in with just what seems like the sound of one hand clapping to begin with, before eventually bringing in the stumbly beat. Once again, he puts the sloshy effect on the vocals and the chords though to make it sound like you're listening to it through an aquarium. And like several of the remixes in this style on this album, it just feels like more of a sketch of an idea rather than a fully fleshed out rework. The remix of Hixon's that has the most in common with the original source material is his version of No New News. The original is another up-tempo number, but it's not really drum and B. The drums almost sound like they're played rather than programmed. And although they're kind of cool to begin with on the original, they sort of feel a little bit like they're kind of just trailing along with the elements of the track, like cans on the back of a just married carriage. Hixon's version sticks with the basic elements of the original in terms of the Fender chords and the vocals, but just gives it a slightly starker, more weighty electro beat. And genuinely it fits like a glove. I think it just sort of tidies up the original to make it that little bit more effective overall. When Hixon tries to find a halfway point between his house music style and Liv's R&B style, the results are often kind of creepy and uncanny. His remix of Clowns, for example, just sort of superimposes a house beat over the sneaking bass line from the original.
Shit doesn't feel good and I won't admit to it, pretend to see that we were made for each other, but are we living in a
Like, it doesn't feel like it's trying to make the track danceable at all. It almost feels like the elements are sort of trying to stomp on the original. It also kind of ignores a lot of the great structural stuff of the original. Everything just exists at a low level for the track's 3 minutes and then it stops. With its remix of Ghost, he takes the Fender chords from the original and lays them over a stomping house beat. And it feels like it kind of works quite well for the first half of it, as Liv's vocals have that kind of FKA Twigs fragility over the top of this house beat, which suits them really well. However, towards the end she goes into the same shouting match that she does in the original track, and Hixon makes absolutely no concessions for it whatsoever in the production. So she's just raging away while the exact same deep house framework is pumping away underneath. A couple of these house R&B hybrids have some very interesting effects though, like his remix of Heartbreak Escape. The original is built around a synth line that reminds me of Mika Levi's production, with this kind of ticking beat underneath.
Never wanted my attention. She said you're so immature.
Hixon's remix is once again pretty sparse, although he largely builds it around the vocal harmonies from the original, which, clipped of those original keyboards, just sound incredibly eerie. It's in a way that I find quite enjoyable, but again, it doesn't so much feel like it's trying to be dancey as it feels like it's trying to be haunted. And his final remix on the album, Glass Shadows, is kind of the most sparse and chilling of the lot. Here everything's reduced down to just a house beat and a very slight bass line, with the vocals once again lowered in pitch. The beat is really thumping on this one, although for the first minute or so of the track it all sounds like it's being piped in from round the corner. But even when it all does come into sharp focus, there's still something very uncanny valley about this whole track. Weirdly unsettling, and I kind of wish it went on for a little bit longer because I'd love to have heard this developed a bit more, but there is something to be said about the sparseness of this. Overall though, GITHP Remix Edition is a very weird remix album. In its weakest moments it almost sounds like Hixon just sort of overstretched himself with this project and had to cut corners a little bit to get it done. Whereas at its best moments it feels like a house producer trying to push his production into new areas. And it's kind of weird because I assumed that's what was going on here, but I listened to the first few Liv EPs that Hixon worked on, and he can produce this sort of R&B.
So please won't you reach out your hands and make my dreams come true like that.
And it's hard to really tell if maybe he's lost touch with that aspect of his production style, or if he's just using this as an experiment to kind of go into some new areas. And when it comes to my favourite remix on this album, some of these experiments would be pretty decent honourable mentions for me. But I have to say, and I feel a little bad for this, but my favourite remix of his is one where he's kind of within his comfort zone, which is his remix of Snowing. I just think of all the remixes here, this is a really good deep house track that actually captures a decent amount of the spirit of the original. The moments on this album I found the least enjoyable, however, are the ones where it just feels like Hixon's clinging too heavily to his standard house sound. And in his remix of Our Father, he just kind of sounds really checked out of the project by that point. His remix of Back Alley is also not that far off, although at least on that one there seems to be some playing around with the chord progression on it, whereas Our Father just sounds really phoned in. And is this selection of remixes better than the original? I'd say this one just about scrapes a partly rating for me due to the remix of No New News. It is very much the equivalent of that Simpsons scene where Homer just puts a few fins on the power plant and wins an award for it, but sometimes a bit of light touching up is all you really need from a remix. But yeah, honestly, although there's a few curiosities here that are kind of compelling, I don't think any of these really trouble the originals that much. There are some interesting ideas throughout this remix album though, and even though I don't think I could recommend it as a full listening experience on its own, I did get some enjoyment out of listening to the remixes directly after their original counterparts, as it almost made them feel like they were kind of additional commentary on what I'd just heard. Anyhow, that is GITHP Remix Edition. Thank you very much for watching this review. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're interested in hearing more reviews of remix content, and if you have any suggestions for stuff I should review in the future, do drop me a comment. And if you've heard these two albums, do let me know which one you preferred, and yeah, that's that. This review is over.